Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I guess we ran out of chairs. Welcome to you all. My name is Yusuf Mahmoud. I'm a senior advisor here at the International Peace Institute. On behalf of IPI and our co-hosts, the permanent missions of Peru and Australia, I am pleased to welcome you to this policy forum dedicated to the presentation of the Secretary General's report on peacebuilding and sustaining peace. As you all know, on 27th April 2016, member states adopted by consensus identical General Assembly Security Council resolutions introducing the concept of sustaining peace as an overarching goal of peacebuilding processes. The resolution were member states' response to the report of the advisory group of experts on the review of the UN peacebuilding architecture entitled The Challenge of Sustaining Peace, which they released in June 2015. The report that will be presented today is in response to paragraph 30 of these joint resolutions. This policy forum is one of several events being organized in the next few weeks to familiarize member states and the public at large, like yourselves, with the contents and objectives of the report. The SG himself is scheduled to introduce it to the General Assembly on 5th of March. And as you know, the same report will be the subject of a high-level meeting on peacebuilding and sustaining peace convened by the President of the General Assembly on 24th and 25th April. To present and discuss the report today, we are joined by senior representatives of the three key entities of the UN system that were intimately involved in the preparation of this report, namely the Peacebuilding Support Office, United Nations Development Program, and the Department of Political Affairs. There are others, but these are the ones we were able to corral. In addition, we have the permanent representative of Australia, to my right, Ambassador Gillian Bird. As you know, Australia, as a co-facilitator together with Angola, played a key role in shepherding the intergovernmental negotiations that transformed the ambitious recommendation of the advisory group report into the substantially identical resolution I just mentioned. She will provide her reflections on the report and the recommendations contained in it. You will find the bios of our speakers in the blue handout that is before you. I am happy to acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Gaspar Martins of Angola, whom I will give the floor later on to say a few words. But before I turn to our esteemed panel, I would like to welcome Ambassador Gustavo Meza Cuadra Velasquez, the permanent representative of Peru, one of our co-sponsors, to say a few opening remarks. You have the floor, sir.
Excellencies, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to welcome you all to these informal discussions of the recommendations of the Secretary General's report on peacebuilding and sustaining peace, and how this further the implementation of the resolutions on the matters adopted by the General Assembly on the Security Council back in 2016. I would like to start by thanking the International Peace Institute, particularly Mr. Mahmoud, for hosting us and organizing this important and timely discussion. We have the privilege of having with us Ambassador Gillian Bird of Australia, co-facilitator of the international consensus leading to the adoption of these resolutions. Also, Mr. Oscar Fernando Taranco, ASG for the Peacebuilding Support Office, Mr. Miroslav Jenka, ASG for the Department of Political Affairs, and Ms. Kathy Thompson from UNDP, all of whom have been involved in the elaboration of the report. Peru is honored to be one of the sponsors of this discussion. Based on our national own experience, we attach a high priority to the promotion of peace building and sustaining peace for the maintenance of international peace and security. Indeed, Peru can be considered a case study for sustaining peace. In our recent history, we defeated terrorism and passed from 2 decades of chronic instability to the consolidation of our democracy and an unprecedented period of economic growth and poverty eradication. Our success is directly linked to a wide national consensus on the need to address the root causes of conflict through an integral approach entailing peace and security, development and human rights policies, and concrete measures, as well as strengthening accountable and inclusive societies. The participation of the private sector and the civil society and the involvement of women and youth proved to be essential for moving forward in sustaining peace in Peru. The attention and assistance of the international community has also proven to be beneficial for fostering such a general goal and process. Of course, no one size fits all, and every country has to find its own path to sustaining peace. But it is much what the United Nations can do to support national efforts in that regard. The same is valid for conflict prevention and post-conflict peace building. We therefore welcome the report of the Secretary General on the matters. In order to address its numerous recommendations and further implement the resolutions, as well as to exchange national perspective and experiences, the President of the General Assembly has convened a high-level meeting on sustaining peace on April 24 and 25th. As a complement to that event, I can announce that Peru, as incoming President of the Security Council for April, will propose a high-level briefing on the implications of that report for the works of the Council. This will take place on the afternoon of April 25th. We see merits for further advancing issues of coordination within the UN system in order to allow peace missions established by the Council to properly assess and manage risks and thus prevent further escalations of conflict. Such coordination is also important for ensuring smooth transitions between set peace operations and peace building and sustaining peace activities by regular country teams. With this, I now give the floor to our distinguished moderator, Dr. Youssef Mahmoud. Youssef, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And thank you for offering Peru as a case study. We're going to take your word on it. We've been looking to learn from societies that are at peace and what they can tell us when we address other societies under stress. So I appreciate, and the key words that you mentioned, national consensus, accountable and inclusive society, are key words for us. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to our first member of our panel, Oscar Fernandez Taranco, who will walk us briefly through the report, highlighting its key recommendations, with perhaps a particular focus on the role of PBSO is expected to play as a hinge between the peace and security pillar and other pillars. I have asked, and the panelists have kindly agreed, to limit their intervention to maximum 10 minutes. If they pass 10 minutes, you'll see me go into epileptic dance, and I'm sure they will spare me that unsightly action. So without further ado, Oscar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Youssef, and it is a very big pleasure and a big honor to be here with so many of you present today. I think all of you, in one way or another, have contributed to this report from the Secretary General on sustaining peace and peace building. This has been quite an unusual internal consultative process involving more than 22 agencies, funds, and programs, external partners, many of you represented here, member states, So it is truly something that speaks to the collective, I think, expectations and need, actually, to translate the vision and the vision of this twin resolution of the Security Council and the General Assembly passed more than 2 years ago into concrete action. And it's very much, I would say, at the very heart of much of what the Secretary General is doing in terms of rolling out his reforms on the peace and security pillar, the reform of the development system and management reforms. So again, to thank you, Yusuf, for putting this together, and to thank, of course, Ambassador from Peru and Ambassador from Australia that have been engaging with us so much in launching this going forward. As was stated, the President of the General Assembly will be organizing an event to precisely discuss many of the recommendations and options included in this report. Next Monday at 3 p.m. in the Trusteeship Council, the Secretary General himself is going to be presenting his report to the membership, and of course, all of you who can attend. And I think it is the kickstart, if you will, of an engagement of the membership in terms of turning this report into reality. You will recall that the twin resolutions of the General Assembly and the Security Council happened after a year-long review of and based on the report of the advisory group of experts, the so-called H group. And you will recall that this advisory group of experts on the review of the peace-building architecture, main argument was that while any effort that was not centered on durable solutions would do little more than set the stage for the next round of violence, and that peace-building was still often left as an afterthought, under-recognized, under-prioritized, under-resourced. And in the meantime, the failure to successfully prevent the lapse and the relapse into conflict was having an irreversible repercussions for the credibility of the global action and the reputation of the United Nations. The adoption of these twin resolutions demonstrated that the member states were ready to stand up to this challenge, and I think this is now where the UN needs to respond quite forcefully. The resolutions are a pledge to move beyond the rhetorical commitments. It defines sustaining peace as a core task of the United Nations and devise innovative and practical solutions to go forward. The Secretary General's recent report on peace building and sustaining peace, again, is our response to this call. First and foremost, the report reiterates the concrete and practical nature of sustaining peace, a coherent, comprehensive, integrated UN response across the life cycle of conflict, before, during, and after, to make, to build, to keep, and sustain peace in an efficient, integrated, and cost-effective manner. National ownership, of course, is key. It's at the heart of these efforts. Peace building and sustaining peace is primarily the responsibility of member states, but the importance of inclusivity and people-centered approaches resonate throughout this report, if you have read it. The report highlights the progress achieved on enhancing operational and policy coherence within the UN towards building and sustaining peace through showing good practices and identifying the remaining challenges and gaps. It relies on concrete examples, as varied as the interventions in the Central African Republic, in Liberia, the Sahel region, Sri Lanka, Papua New Guinea, Somalia, Solomon Islands, Cote d'Ivoire. To foster coherence and integration, the report makes a particularly strong call in favor of joined-up analysis, including on the ground, to adequately identify political context, risks, challenges, as well as the factors that contribute to peace, and translate them into coherent strategies and actions in support of member states' own efforts and priorities. The report recognizes that the scale of global peace and security challenges are such that this requires that we become much more serious about the partnerships and the cooperation that the United Nations needs to undertake with other key actors involved in peace building. In particular, regional, sub-regional organizations, which has become a top priority for this Secretary General, as well as international financial institutions, civil society, and the private sector. The importance of the UN cooperation with the World Bank in assisting conflict-affected countries receives specific attention, particularly in the context of the operationalization and implementation of the joint UN World Bank study on the link between development and prevention in the report entitled Pathways to Peace, and also translating into action the framework agreement that was signed between the UN and the World Bank. The resolutions also emphasize the importance of the role of women and youth in sustaining peace. And again, very shortly, we will soon be discussing the independently authored progress report on youth, peace, and security as the outcome of the resolution 2250. And I understand that Peru is also seriously considering this debate within the Council for this particularly important report. This SG's report, again, underscores the coherence and complementarity among the principal organs of the United Nations, including the governing bodies of many of the agency's funds and programs, is critical to address the fragmentation and the silos. It highlights the unique role of the Peacebuilding Commission as a key platform and forum to enhance intergovernmental coherence across the pillars, including its advisory and bridging role between the General Assembly Security Council. It demonstrates how the Peacebuilding Commission has been diversifying its working methods and working more flexibly in support of national processes, mission transitions, cross-border and regional issues, and again, providing very concrete examples and context, again, the Great Lakes region, the Sahel, Liberia, Burkina Faso, Colombia, Sri Lanka, Kyrgyzstan, and the list goes on. The revitalization of the Peacebuilding Support Office and the scaling up of the Peacebuilding Fund are critical for ensuring UN system-wide coherence, again, across the conflict cycle. The report points to the potential of the PBSO for connecting relevant tools and approaches across the conflict spectrum and facilitating, again, joined-up analysis, planning, and coherent action, and strengthening partnerships within and beyond the United Nations. And finally, the necessity of ensuring adequate, predictable, and sustained financing for the UN's peacebuilding effort is highlighted as costs of responding to crises have become unsustainably high. The report presents several options on financing, including voluntary, assessed, and innovative sources. And of course, we are ready between now and the high-level event to engage with the member states on the implications of this. The role of the Peacebuilding Fund as a timely, catalytic, risk-tolerant, strategic instrument that incentivizes and helps drive UN coherence is emphasized, following up on the SG's call for a quantum leap for the Peacebuilding Fund. It's a key element of its peace and security reform as well. And again, I think it's important to stress that the role of the Peacebuilding Fund in this moment where so many of the reforms are being discussed has to be seen in its complementarity to development funds and not in competition, especially in its focus in those furthest left behind, in challenging of funds through UN entities that are largely development focused, and its concentration on reaching remote and peripheral areas and thematic issues such as cross-border and regional challenges. The Secretary General has consistently underscored this primacy of the prevention and sustaining peace. As I said, many of his the reforms are inspired by the Sustaining Peace resolution. Just to thank you all again for this great turnout, and I really look forward to the Q&A part of this session, which I think is part of the collective ownership of this report and its translation into practice. Thank you, Yusuf.
Thank you. 8 minutes and 60 seconds. Thank you so much. I much appreciate. 3 things really resonated with me, Oscar. One is the concrete example you gave those reports. Nothing speaks louder than concrete examples. The second, it was music to my ear to hear that when you do joint analysis, not only do you look at the factors that drive and sustain conflict, but the factors that are associated with peace. You know, that's the kind of music to my ear that is. But also I like the way you've described the PBF. Not only is it risk tolerant, but complementary to development fund. I think that's a very important point that you have made. So thank you for that. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Katie Thompson, our senior representative from UNDP. Katie, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here. I wish I had a better joke than I have prepared to keep you all entertained. One of the things that I'd like to highlight on behalf of UNDP, and especially on behalf of UNDG, for who we represented in this process, is the degree of complexity and the degree of experience that the UN has accumulated in the field to try and understand the conditions in which we can manage crisis, but also those conditions within which we can build peace slowly with our national partners. And this point that we've been discussing is going to be particularly important between now and 2030 as we invest in the Agenda 2030 moving forward. That's a very strong centerpiece of this report. Recently, I've been involved in conversations around what the report did not do, so I'm going to hit a couple of those points on the head at the beginning of this presentation, which is the fact that the report has not gone into huge detail around the specific causes or drivers of conflict in different contexts, in particular around issues of climate change or issues of disaster risk that also management of natural resources that also impact on the causes of conflict. These are well recognized and understood as part of the conflict problematic, but they're not explored and examined in depth within the report. What the report seeks to do is to provide a set of actions for addressing risk of all kinds, which are embedded and as the UN we will be committed to. And we think that set of actions amounts to a theory of change in the sense of it's a set of activities and commitments and principles which we think we should be embedded across the reform process and in our own engagement with our country offices and presences as we implement the report. So the other thing that the report has not done is to create a firm distinction between engagement in crisis settings and engagement in those where a crisis is not currently present. What it seeks to do is to reiterate the SG's commitment to prevention as a continuum of action, and a continuum of action that's present that should be present in our engagement at all moments of support, whether we're labeling that support developmental or crisis management, peacekeeping, or direct political engagement. All of these elements need to be calibrated in a way that they are supporting preventive action. And this refocus is as relevant for crisis settings as for other settings. Speaking about the messages of the report, and to reiterate obviously from the perspective of UNDP and the UNDG, is how we can ensure through also the development reforms that the report is focusing on recommendations that stay focused on their needs and stay focused on how our country officers and resident coordinators can work well with our national counterparts to really bring about the calibrated assistance that's needed in this context. Is a strong focus on leadership qualities and on the need for the UN system to be bringing its best and bringing the best that we have to offer from headquarters and from our regional presences to support the leadership under the UNDG, and to enable them to draw from the lessons that we've already learned, the examples of having joined up support from headquarters, from both the Secretariat and from the agencies, to enable them to really draw on what's best. I know that we have colleagues here from the High Commissioner from Human Rights Office, and their engagement in terms of providing human rights mainstreaming and human rights advice to our resident coordinators is absolutely crucial in this process, as is the work that we undertake with DPA and PBSO in deploying peace and development advisors, who engage and support resident coordinators to do political action and to do mainstreaming of conflict analysis within the work at country level. This type of engagement and this type of joined-up approaches, regardless of which part of a bureaucracy we sit in, are the kind of approaches which we're recommending, and we're recommending to be picked up across the board. When you sit in a mission or in a country office and look at headquarters, it really doesn't matter which office you sit in. You represent the fulcrum of what the UN has to offer, and it's really our duty to ensure that we're providing that. In addition to the resources We've heard about the Peacebuilding Fund, and this is a crucial part in terms of resourcing and support to programming, as well as development assistance at country level, often coming from bilateral support that needs to be targeted to a really well-calibrated UNDAF, and a really well-calibrated UNDAF that's based on a common conflict analysis that is understood and supported across the board by the agencies present on the ground. They need to do that with our backup. This is operational backup. We don't do anything without being operational, without being active to make sure that our offices are functioning, but also the political backup and programming and technical expertise that we have deployed around the world. Another important piece, and I think that this has come out quite strongly in the report, is an emphasis on the support to mission contexts, especially as they transition. Many of you will be aware that we have a joint program, many of the actors here, plus colleagues in DPKO and DFS, and we're looking at how we support countries like Cote d'Ivoire, like Liberia, like Haiti in forthcoming transition, and our approach to prevention and embedding support to the national capacities for prevention and national capacities for governance and inclusion and human rights are really critical at these moments of transition planning. I think the case of Liberia is really a solid example in that regard. And this will be, and accompanying Liberia through the next 3 to 5 years is going to be a very important test of our approach on sustaining peace. Finally, I just want to round off because I'm sure there'll be time in the Q&A, and I know that I'm going to be jumped on in a minute for my time limit, is around how we will work towards implementing the SDGs together with our national counterparts. The SDG agenda is going to proceed at an increasingly accelerated pace, and the need to become organized in the sense of in an inclusive manner, which puts women into the equation, which puts civil society into the equation, and really ensures that the process is owned at national level, will really be a reflection of how well we are implementing the principles of sustaining peace. Peace, justice, and inclusion are really at the heart of Agenda 2030, and this is the intersection with this report. And this will be, for UNDP in particular, one of the big challenges going forward under our new strategic plan. Finally, just to say before I pass to my colleagues, I think that the conversation now, and maybe it's a product of having been so exposed to this conversation for the last year, it really needs to move out of New York, and it really needs to move down to our colleagues who are working at country level, where the critical mass of the UN sits. And it's us pivoting ourselves to provide them with that kind of support that we've outlined, that's going to be critical, and which will enable the Sustaining Peace agenda, with your support, to really withstand the test of time. So that's all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. 3 important points that caught my attention, Katie. The first one is about leadership. Working differently together requires leadership, with the insistence on the ship rather than the leader. Second, the way you've talked about peace and development advisors that have been already working jointly. So much we can learn from them, and they've been working jointly in the field. The third is you're talking about transition, on our country in transition, and how we can promote prevention as a governance and development function, not only a peace and security function. And I like your challenge to all of us. We need to take this conversation out of New York, elsewhere, where it matters. Thank you for that. Without further ado, I now give my colleague and friend in many ways, Miroslav Jenscha, the floor. You have the floor, mate.
Thank you, Youssef, and thanks to IPI for organizing this very important and timely discussion. Excellencies, distinguished delegates and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends. I will focus on a few topics because all of you have been very well versed in the topic, and after very good presentations by Oscar and Katie, I would like to avoid repetitions. Let me just add that Sustaining Peace offers a framework to bring salience to our work on the prevention of conflict. The cross-pillar approach and application across the full cycle of conflict advocated by Sustaining Peace validate the UN's prevention work in all country, regional and international contexts. The agenda offers an opportunity to advance concepts and tools around the UN's role in conflict prevention. The priority now for the Sustaining Peace agenda is that it shows results on the ground. Sustaining peace is only useful as a concept if we can point to evidence that it makes a difference in the lives of the people we serve. It is also only as useful in terms of how much it builds national ownership on the ground. As I mentioned, I would like to highlight some of the elements of the report that I feel will make a difference on the ground, particularly from the point of view of our Department of Political Affairs view. A first critical element of the report I would like to underline is its suggestion that Sustaining Peace requires more systematic, integrated analysis leading to better early warning and planning. Department of Political Affairs places also great emphasis on the cross-pillar approach to sustaining peace through the United Nations Joint Programme on building national capacities for conflict prevention, through which we deploy over 40 peace and development advisors to every region. Katie already touched upon this program, so I will not elaborate on it in detail. They work with national partners on addressing drivers of potential conflict and with the UN country teams to ensure that the UN's development engagement is sensitive to the country context. And they are a model for integrated analysis and programming on which we must now build. Today, systematic and system-wide integrated analysis is increasingly becoming the norm used to inform decision-making at the highest levels through the Executive Committee. As you know very well, Executive Committee is part of Secretary General's, Mr. Guterres, reform efforts, and it started very early in his term to ensure integrated decision-making, support for integrated analysis and solutions in the United Nations. And it is a key element of our early warning system by feeding into our regional monthly reviews under the Human Rights Upfront agenda. Working effectively across the peace and security development and human rights pillars, as well as the humanitarian system of the United Nations, requires us to translate relevant normative frameworks into system-wide analysis. This is also the spirit that underlines the forthcoming UN World Bank joint study on prevention entitled Pathways for Peace. A recognition that international investment in development can and should be conflict sensitive. It must be specific to the country context and it must be nationally owned. This recognition by the bank presents significant opportunities for us to take this partnership forward operationally. Second area I want to focus on is the report's focus on regional strategies, approaches, and engagement. The report calls for greater use of flexible regional frameworks for promoting coherent support to sustaining peace. The Secretary General called for increasingly systematic partnerships with regional and sub-regional organizations in sustaining peace. As you know, part of the reform of the Secretary General, notably Peace and Security Architecture reform, provides for creation of one political, operational, regional structure with 3 Assistant Secretary General responsible for all political and operational work of the United Nations in the regions in the field. We see the United Nations regional political offices as integral to our collective efforts to build and sustain peace in fragile settings. That is particularly critical as preventing violent conflict using preventive diplomacy, mediation, and other tools in our peace and security toolbox represents an important component of sustaining peace. As the HIPPO, High-Level Independent Panel for Peace Operations report recognized the Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy in Central Asia, United Nations Office in Western Africa and Sahel, and the office in Central Africa have been particularly effective platforms for preventive diplomacy and mediation. They remain among our most relevant instruments for early warning in their respective regions. They have continued to play a credible, though discreet, facilitating role in support of the Secretary General's Good Office's mandate in addressing emerging or incipient conflict, as you have seen recently in the context of crisis in the Gambia, Gabon, Burkina Faso, and in 2010 in Kyrgyzstan, in my own experience. Let me say very clearly that I will speak about the region I worked in for several years in Central Asia, that it is acknowledged by the countries in the region and international community as a successful example. But if this regional center for preventive diplomacy had not been there, we wouldn't have had opportunity to help, to support the people in the country, the region, and broader international community to actually calm down the situation and ensure that those peace-building efforts bring fruits. It continues even now with peace-building funds resources used, and also in regional scale. DPA has also built its relations with regional organizations through liaison presences such as our partnerships with OSCE, with ASEAN, and with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We are now in talks with League of Arab States about establishing liaison office in Cairo in Egypt. Through close and continuous collaboration with regional member states and regional and sub-regional organizations, they have proven their ability to address transnational and regional grievances, driving crisis, and to help develop potential solutions. They have also undertaken efforts to strengthen the mediation capacity of regional and sub-regional organizations. I will not mention concrete examples because we are running out of time, and I wouldn't like to be punished by Yusuf. So through their proximity with all actors inside and out the United Nations system, regional offices can help ensure that our efforts to sustain peace are coordinated and synchronized. These are tangible aspects that I wanted to highlight for you from a DPA perspective, just 2 of them, because there are many more, but for the time's sake, I would leave more space for questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miroslav. I want to pick up on 3 important points that you highlighted in your intervention. I think what I liked is that finally the sustainable peace agenda or framework is putting we the peoples at the center. And we will be judged by the difference we make in the lives of people. I really feel that's an important opportunity we shouldn't miss. The second is the importance of integrated analysis that is conflict sensitive to ensure that no harm is done while we are trying in good faith to support. Partnership is important. The last point, which I appreciate very much, is the emphasis on regional strategies, given that most of the problems that afflict countries are regional, both in origin and effect. It's important that regional perspective is taken, particularly if we are promoting preventive diplomacy. And your own experience in Central Asia really is a very always quoted by us, at least, as an excellent example. And I'm happy to hear that you're reaching out to the League of Arab States. Thank you for that. Last but not least, it's my pleasure now to give the floor to Ambassador Bird, Permanent Representative of Australia. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thanks. Thank you, Yusuf, and IPI for organising this event, but also for your active leadership on sustaining peace more broadly. And it's definitely encouraging to see so many here today, which again just shows the energy and enthusiasm there is for this important work. It's great to have this opportunity to have a first discussion of the Secretary-General's report on peacebuilding and sustaining peace. As you mentioned, I had the honour of co-facilitating with my colleague from Angola, it's great to see here today, the parallel Security Council and GA resolutions on sustaining peace that actually mandated this report. A lot of time and effort went into developing the resolutions. There was significant engagement by a wide range of member states, Secretariat, and more broadly. And they're seen as pretty groundbreaking resolutions. They established for the first time in a UN resolution the concept of sustaining peace, and they established very ambitious objectives for effective peacebuilding and improved conflict prevention. And when we were developing the resolutions, one of the things we did very, very deliberately was to set out the requirement for this report, and we were quite prescriptive. If you look at the resolutions, Operative Power 30, we deliberately asked for ambitious and comprehensive report covering a wide range of issues, including the more difficult and intractable ones like financing. So we wanted it to be ambitious and comprehensive. We also asked for it at this time frame, 2 years on, with a view to ensuring that it was very much part of the new Secretary-General, the incoming Secretary-General's mandate and his responsibility. It's been very encouraging to see the energy which the Secretary-General, others in the Secretariat, civil society, member states have continued to devote to this agenda. And I should pay tribute to the Secretary-General. I mean, leadership from the top is incredibly important, and he grasped sustaining peace probably before many of us did, and certainly has put it at the heart of what he's trying to achieve here at the UN. I should say at the outset too, I think it's a good report. I should have said that at the beginning. It is a good report. It's importantly practical and forward-looking, so which is great to see. What the report does quite well is it does reflect the ambition of those parallel resolutions, and it talks about the progress that has been made so far. There's still a lot to be done, but the progress that's been made in trying to transform the UN into a more field-focused, coherent system, which invests more effectively in prevention and in partnerships and conflict prevention. It talks about specific actions that need to be taken or are being taken by the UN. It also sets out a range of options for member states to consider. It does show how far we've come in some areas. It's been mentioned by others on the panel. I think the Peacebuilding Commission has really started to come into its own, and it's the new approaches that are being taken and since the resolutions were adopted, and I pay tribute to the Peacebuilding Commission and its chairs. It also has a welcome emphasis, as others have mentioned, on inclusive approaches and the involvement of women. That's very much reflected in the resolutions, which talked about the importance of inclusive approaches and also on partnerships. One other area where I think the report is extremely useful is it's one of the few which genuinely explores how the three strands of reform, so the peace and security, the development and the management, how they relate and come together. And it's essential that they do so if the whole concept of sustaining peace is to be realised. As I said, the report in my view, rightly looks at the operational level, what's been done and what needs to happen next. And this is notwithstanding the fact that there is still some debate in UN circles about sustaining peace. The resolution sets out very clearly a definition that was important. It was one of the last things we negotiated and was required. A number of delegations said, what does it mean? So we have slightly unwieldy and long, but there is a definition in there. That's not to say that there's not some value in further exploring the concept, but I think we need to be very careful we don't get bogged down in sort of theological debate about what sustaining peace is and what it's not. I think the best way to clarify what it is to do what this report has done, and it's to look at how it is being implemented and how it can be implemented. So to try and make it real. So practical examples in the report, for example, and it was talked about by Katie, the UNDP, DPA, Peace and Development Advisor Program, those kind of practical avenues, I think the most useful way of illustrating how we can go about developing and implementing sustaining peace. We shouldn't lose sight of the broader dimensions. Again, others have mentioned. The report looks at not just on the UN's ability, but also, again, this has been stressed by others, the primary responsibility of national governments and authorities. National ownership is critical, so the role they can play. And then also, and I'll quote it because I think it's quite a good way of describing it, how sustaining peace should be, and I quote, broadly understood as a goal and a process to build a common vision of a society, ensuring that the needs of all segments of the population are taken into account. So the people-centred approach others have mentioned. So we need to keep that broader focus in mind. Looking ahead, and I'll be brief here. So looking ahead, and at the risk of sounding really overly bureaucratic, I hesitated to say this, and at the risk of depressing those who wrote this report, I actually think we need another report. Now, I know it sounds terrible, doesn't it? But it's actually an important point, and it's not just a point of process, it is substantive. There's currently no mandate for further reporting on sustaining peace implementation. And if we don't take action to create a mandate, this is the UN after all, if we don't create action for a mandate and for a new report, there won't be one. We have a golden opportunity to do so as member states at the high-level event that the PGA is convening in late April. It's a great opportunity. I think there'll be a very high-level gathering. Good to have that discussion. But I think we need to have a forward-looking discussion that then takes us to the next level. There is a real risk at the UN. If you don't, unfortunately, mandate ongoing processes, they can be put on the shelf. And let me just make, and I'll do it briefly, 3 things that I think are important in why we need this further work, further report. Firstly, financing. This was one of the more difficult parts of the parallel resolutions, and it's explicitly covered in paragraph 30, the paragraph that sets out what we wanted the SG to do, and it specifically asked for options on financing, options on both assessed and voluntary contributions. And I think the report's done a good job here. It has actually set out a full suite of options. And if we've got that full suite of options, we need to look at them and work out which makes sense, which we can do, and how we should go about doing it. So we need to have a further process for that. Secondly, there is other unfinished business. So it's not just the financing, which is very important, but there are many valuable recommendations in the report for member states and for the Secretariat, and we need to follow them up. And then finally, I think it's important going forward that we have in a sense, a home for this vision of reform. I think this is central for the Secretary-General, this vision of reform. And what we've seen at the UN, and it's perhaps inevitable, but we've got 3 tracks, and there's a bit of a risk that you start going down into the minutiae of each of the 3 tracks, and you forget how they come together, and you lose that holistic sense of why we're reforming the UN. As I said, the Secretary-General has been excellent on this even before he became Secretary-General. He's given very clear expositions of what he wants, a more coherent, field-focused UN with effective preventive tools, with robust, mutually beneficial partnerships. He spelled that out very clearly. And sustaining peace remains one of the most powerful organising concepts for that vision. And it will become only more important as those separate reform processes, but interrelated, continue. So look, whether or not we have a further report, this is obviously an ongoing issue, but we do think this is time for member states who see value in being part of this continuing discussion, who want to continue the discussion with the Secretary-General and the Secretariat, to stand up and say so. I think we should do so when the Secretary General presents his report on the 5th of March. That we want to stay engaged, we want to see more work, we want to see a further report, and I think we should do so in April at the high-level sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bird. Again, for us who have observed the process, this is really a unique process of what happens when members own the process and take the leadership of carrying it. It's really one of the rare opportunities that I have witnessed 30 years of the UN, when there is the proper leadership at member state. When member states are in the lead, it's amazing what can happen. Second, I'm happy that you have highlighted the progress the Peacebuilding Commission has made. I think that is very important, and the type of innovations that they have engaged in is really noteworthy. Last but not least, and I'm glad you mentioned this issue, and maybe this is something that member states should keep in mind when they engage during the high-level event in April. What is next? And I think, as we all know, this bureaucracy, if there is no anchor on which to continue this conversation, and the conversation is not finished, and I'll mention in my concluding remark why, just to enrich what you've just said for us, I think this is at least one practical outcome we should aim for at the high-level panel. Before I open the floor to question and answer, I'd like to acknowledge Ambassador Gaspar Martins to say a few words, either from where you are, sir, or at the podium. What would you like? I'll get the microphone. Here you are.
Well, first of all, let me say that I am extremely pleased that I can be here to participate in this discussion. I thought it would never be possible with the other demands that I now have. But this is the report, as Gillian has just emphasized, which we can consider really membership-driven. We own it. If we are talking about ownership, we do own it, and I hope the country, what has been so often emphasized, the ownership of the countries, it's extremely important. Also, what I would like to call the attention that we have been looking for some kind of a roadmap for dealing with crisis. This is a roadmap. This is a roadmap for the crisis in development, which still exists, and I think we have a great opportunity to address this now through this report, and I hope that the Secretary General that we have, who has put so much emphasis on this, on results, and also what I have heard, the need to take this discussion to the ground, to the field. That's where we need to have discussion and action, so that when we go to the what next, the question that has been raised, we should be able to look back and say, yes, there was something that we identified, what next to do, and we are effectively doing. So I would like to thank all the colleagues who have participated in this discussion. I would like to acknowledge here again the good work that I was pleased to do with Gillian, and with you, Mahmoud, please, this is now the thing to do, so that when we look back at UN, we say, yes, we are effectively performing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and yes, thank you. Provided us with an added reason why we must have a follow-up resolution, so at least we can start taking the show to the road. It's an added reason. Before I open the floor, I'd like to give the ambassador of Bangladesh to say a few words. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf, our moderator for today. I also thank the permanent missions of Australia and Peru, and also IPI for the invitation. We appreciate the informative presentations by the Assistant Secretaries General and Ms. Thompson of UNDP. We look forward to the Secretary General's formal presentation of the report on 5th of March, that is next week. My delegation's general observation is that the Secretary General's report has done justice to what had been expected of it by the twin resolutions. The report is concise and thus does not perhaps have the scope to elaborate on all aspects to the satisfaction of all the stakeholders. We should rather focus on its concrete recommendations and their underlying rationale and continue to build on them. It is encouraging that the relevant entities within the UN system had been extensively consulted on compiling this report. It is critical that there is a buy-in from all concerned in order to withstand traditional resistance or skepticism at times evident from within the system. There is a need for a word of caution here. However, it may be a natural response to jump into the bandwagon of sustaining peace and repackage any ongoing and contemplated initiatives under its remit. This may prove to be counterproductive at times, especially in the context of the development and human rights pillars. It is to be acknowledged that the notion of sustaining peace is still new. Even though the resolutions were adopted by consensus, some member states may yet require time to arrive at a shared understanding of the constituent elements and implications of sustaining peace. In order for the notion to gain further traction, we should keep working and allow the time for all member states to see the merit of this paradigm shift in our common vision for peace. One possible approach in that direction could be to shape our discourse in pursuit of pathways for peace instead of using a conflict-sensitive lens in every case. This perhaps needs further elaboration, but what we are trying to say is that it does matter how we frame our approach in order to make it more acceptable or palatable to national authorities and other stakeholders. To our reading, a peace and development-centered approach can have a better chance at securing national ownership and inclusivity towards building the mechanisms for conflict prevention and resolution. It is an important aspect of the report that both DPA and UNDP had been closely involved in its preparation. We are, however, aware that translating such partnership into concrete deliverables on the ground can be fraught with many challenges. It would certainly require frank and informed consultations among member states about the performance of some of the existing partnership initiatives and how to make them work better. At the headquarters, we consider it to be a creative idea to make the PBSO the so-called hinge for effective interface among the three pillars of the organization. We believe this would allow PBSO to act as a catalytic entity to promote change through the system over time. It has been duly observed that the report brings together all the three strands of the UN reform initiatives. We understand that without addressing the reform proposals in a conclusive manner, we would perhaps not be able to make much headway with implementing the various recommendations in this report. What is important is that bringing these different strands together at a single point can have far-reaching positive implications for the UN peace-building architecture if the cards are played right. We would certainly wish to see the optimum utilization of the convening and advisory roles of the Peacebuilding Commission functioning as a whole. We had urged the Secretary General to be bold, ambitious, and creative with his recommendations on financing for peacebuilding. My delegation feels that the Secretary General has offered us sufficient materials to work on in the coming days. We would seek enhanced and sustained resources for peacebuilding and sustaining peace, while we would also need to have the assurance that it would not adversely impact financing for development. All these issues merit further discussion, if not another follow-up report as mentioned by Gillian, and cannot possibly be resolved during the lead up to the high-level event on peace building and sustaining peace in April this year. We must keep the process alive for simultaneous discussions on all the key cluster of issues and their corresponding recommendations in the Secretary General's report. For that, the high-level event gives us an opportunity to harness political support for a continued process. Our delegation is ready to work on a resolution for the purpose if there is consensus to that effect. Thank you.
I thank you, Ambassador, and I thank you for that cautionary note and for how we should approach this issue so it matures and the necessary buy-in, and whether the peace and development approach is far more appropriate than security approach is well noted. And I it underscores what Ambassador Bird indeed have said, that we should give time to time, and the role of PBSO as a catalytic entity for promoting that deeper engagement and buy-in. Finally, the floor is yours, ladies and gentlemen. We have a good 25 minutes or so. I'll take 3 questions at a time, maybe more. I will take 4 if there are 4 fingers. So I'll start with one here and then all the way in the back. That's 2 already. Please tell us who you are.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Tomlinson from the Quaker United Nations office. Many thanks to our speakers, to our hosts, but also to the writers of this report, who we very much welcome all the hard work that went into this. Now, it is perhaps self-evident that peace cannot take hold without the active participation of all segments of society. Not only can peace not be imposed by one group over any others, but requires the active engagement of those impacted and over long periods of time. And the report includes important acknowledgement of the role of inclusion and the role of civil society and other actors. But in reality, as we look around the world as we see it in our headlines today, with the rise of authoritarian and securitized approaches, just as we are beginning to understand the critical nature of civil society in peace-building processes, we see the space for civil society not just shrinking, because that's a passive word, I would say actively under attack, and not just in fragile and conflict-affected situations as well. So the question then is to our panelists, what can member states and the UN system do in the spirit of this report to address this crisis, which threatens to undermine our efforts to build sustaining peace before we have even properly begun? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Danieli, all the way in the back.
Hi, I'm Dr. Danieli of the International Organization for Victims Assistance. This has been one of the richest panels I've attended, so thank you for that. What I am missing as a person who has been on the ground after conflict in too many places is the mention of education, the mention of health. Much of the discussion is so structural that it's hard to envision how it's going to further our progress with getting to the people themselves. And when you talk about sustainable, of course, you're talking about intergenerational developments as well. We know that conflict has not only lifelong, but multi-generational effects, and that even further underscores the 2 pillars of health or healing, if you focus on development and peace, as I like so much. And of course, number 1, education on all levels, not just in schools, but public education in any way you can. I don't see hope without those. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other competition of hands, so perhaps without further ado, I'll bring back this to the panel. 2 questions, essentially. One is, how can we stop this active erosion of space for civil society engagement? And these recommendations seem to be mostly structural, and yet there are important role that education and health can play in laying the foundation for sustaining peace. I'll leave it to, maybe I will start with my right, if that's okay with you, Ambassador Bird.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for the comments and thank you for the comments and questions. I'll speak up. Civil society first. I couldn't agree more about the importance of civil society's engagement in the Sustaining Peace agenda, but more broadly. You're right, it is under challenge here at the UN and elsewhere. What can we do about it as member states? Well, as member states, what's really important is that we do continue to defend the importance of civil society engagement. and certainly my delegation and others we work with do that every day at the UN. It's broader than the sustaining peace area. It cuts across everything that indeed the UN is involved in and engaged in, migration, development, all of the issues we're discussing. So there's really no option but for those member states who think it is important that civil society continues to play an active and engaged role to defend that. And we need to do that when we're looking at what's called the modalities. I always thought modalities resolution sounded so boring. I had no idea that modalities resolutions are actually incredibly important for deciding what actually happens at the UN. So when we're looking at the modalities for the various conferences, and when we're looking at who comes and is involved in address, the Secretariat can talk a bit more about what they do, but that's what we can do as member states. Education and health, I couldn't agree more. They're incredibly important. I know we've talked a lot about the sort of structural issues and how the UN can operate as one and coherence and breaking down silos. But the challenge is also, and I think our colleague from UNDP talked about it, we then do need to translate it on at the ground level, and what does that actually mean? And clearly education and health are critically important, and also have the inclusive dimensions, so the gender dimensions of education and health. So yes, I mean, that is what we don't specifically mention some of those sectors, but when you look at what it does mean on the ground, obviously that's when you do have to look at areas like that and how to make that effectively part of the implementation process. So, thank you.
Thank you, Oscar.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I hope that the report actually reflects what has been an active consultation process with civil society, as I mentioned at the start, and I think it reflects this changing notion of partnerships, that it takes many diversified partnerships to get results on the ground. And we can say this from programmatic experience, and we have seen actually the need to reach out and to include in these joint assessments, if you will, of what the priorities are, what the key drivers of tensions or resilience, what should we be building? What is it that the societies are demonstrating as resilient solutions? People-centered solution requires that we actually work very actively, including in the analytical framework, civil society, in partnership, of course, with the governments, with the UN agencies, funds, programs involved. This is not rhetorical. It's part of how peace-building strategies are actually devised. And it's done in such a way because at the end of the day, it's how we deliver, how we actually implement the strategy. And this is the big challenge that the UN faces. I think Katie and others have referred to it, is translating analysis and strategies into practical programs. And here, I think the Peace Building Fund actually has been quite innovative in this respect, because we actually use civil society actors as direct implementers to complement actually UN engagement. And we use this, interestingly, as a way of creating space, as a way of creating dialogue, as a way of creating trust and confidence. We know that in many places where we have to address this notion of the humanitarian peace development nexus, that many civil societies are directly involved in humanitarian delivery, in development delivery, in peace building delivery. So I think this is about trust building. This is about demonstrating value added, not just in the thinking, but in the implementation. And we are very happy. I mean, we have demonstrable results. We do have regular women empowerment and youth promotion initiatives that many times, again, in agreement with governments concerned, are directly involved in the implementation of the initiative. And many times, again, because we're focused in those regions that have been left behind many times. And in those regions, you will find very active civil society engaged, which we need to support as part of a national solution, local, regional solution. So again, implementation, capacity is what we're also after. That needs to be mobilized, needs to be an inclusive approach, and I think the report on education and health, this is extremely important, and I think how we address grievance mechanisms in the delivery of those services is a crucial part of the dialogue. Whose health, whose education, where, and how, and again, in very trying circumstances, the fund, the Peacebuilding Fund, through agencies, but also civil society organizations and government ministries, have been addressing this issue of the culture of peace, tolerance. We've been looking into issues of curricula, identifying drivers of exclusion and intolerance. And so this is a conversation that requires many partners. It's not just working with this or just working with that. I think that is the inclusive nature of this agenda, that it takes many to deliver the results of peace building.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. Andrew, I think your question is almost code for asking us about how we work on creating political space generally and not just for civil society groups. And I think it's a really important one. And obviously, there are many ways in which the UN can catalyze that space, including through advocacy functions, either globally or locally, as well as working, empowering and supporting civil society development through technical programs of support. And some work better than others. They don't all work well in all settings, but it's certainly a commitment that you will see in this report, and it's a commitment that I think is embedded in the organizations that we work for. And we have some really good concrete examples of how that works through local mediators, local civil society organizations, has directly contributed to national peace processes, or for opening space for conversations on human rights issues, for speaking truth to power when there are suppressive practices, and where the UN is supporting human rights defenders, for example. So there are many good examples of how that work can be done, and we sought to find a balance within the report as to ensure that was reflected. But it certainly wasn't only focused on working with civil society as service providers for everyone else, or co-opted as procurement partners for the UN system. It really was focused on this idea of creating a bigger tent within which this conversation would be had, and the UN securing that political space for action. Now, I think it's always much easier said than done, and it really does require our country teams and our resident coordinators to be able to be supported in doing that work, and often it has to be backed up by political messages from here and from Geneva. And so that's a very, very much a key part of this report. I think the way I have been thinking about this recently was to think about it in terms of creating antibodies within a society that inoculates against conflict risk. We have a really solid example in Malawi of the peace policy, which has been adopted through the Women and Youth Peace Network there. And we have another in Togo. And it was interesting, and maybe working with yourself, Yusuf, we could look at the extent to which these groups are enabling societies to be more resilient. And resilient doesn't mean they need to accept oppressive or unjust practices, but really to be able to be empowered to speak out when there's crisis. So we need to look at it closely and understand impact. On education and health, in general, we in the, and maybe this is not quite helpful, but we tend to package education and health services and social services within a package of what we call basic services and basic service provision that's essential, especially in crisis-hit contexts. And the extent to which a state can rebuild those services and make sure they're reaching those in need is a measure of their legitimacy and their relevance and the building of the social contract among peoples and communities. And for those reasons, we have worked across the UNDG, working with colleagues from UNICEF and WFP in this process because of the recognition of that fact. And taking this forward will involve ensuring that those priorities are embedded in our work. So together with Oscar, we work with the World Bank on doing recovery and peace building assessments, and looking at the social sector is a very important part of that process. So we've been doing that in CAR and in Nigeria, but it's not off the radar, even despite those of us who sit here with a peace label. It's an integral part of the work.
Thank you, Miroslav.
Thank you. Let me add maybe a few concrete points, especially as regards the first question. I will use one concrete experience from my past work. When we were talking about a declaration on the plan of action to implement counter-terrorism strategy in Central Asian region, and we spoke about civil society, about human rights, one of the participants then after the session approached me and asked the question, so what do you want? Do you want to fight terrorism or do you want to talk about human rights? My answer was, in 2006, the General Assembly adopted a global counterterrorism strategy, and it was supported by all member states. And it is clear there, the fourth pillar approach. So my point is that we have in the United Nations, the resolutions, documents, etc. The point is how we can implement them. And here I come back to the point that was mentioned several times here, that we need to work on the ground, in the field, with the people. Let me show, you surely had in mind when you asked your question, Andrew, is your name? Yeah. So, situation in Syria. Staffan de Mistura, the special representative of the Secretary General, while it is not possible to impose who will be at the table while negotiating, the peace process, still, what he did, he established the civil society support room. And in this way, what he does, he talks directly to civil society representatives, he listens to them and can bring to the table their views. So what we need to do is, to try as much as we can, especially in the field, on the ground, to engage with civil society, with non-governmental organizations, and also, of course, doing it in implementation of our mandates, because we have the basis, to ensure that their voice is heard, that we can actually take into account the opinions, the views, and benefit from them as regards negotiation of peace agreements, as regards our mediation, facilitation efforts, because even empirically it has been proven that with engagement of civil society, of women, of youth, such agreements are much more durable and sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Maybe we'll take one question. Yes. Ian.
Ian Martin, Security Council report, although my interest in this comes more from the interface between the advisory group of experts and the HIPPO discussions of sustaining peace. I was very glad that three of, I think, the most important concrete things that have been improvements in the UN's work for sustaining peace came through from the panel, the Peace and Development Advisors, the regional offices, and Miroslav quoted what we said about that in HIPPO, and the way in which the Human Rights Upfront initiative contributed in the Secretariat to a more integrated analysis of situations. But I don't feel too optimistic about the current climate for carrying those forward, and that's what I want to ask about. Is the financial and political climate one in which we can envisage member states agreeing to the establishment of more regional offices, which would undoubtedly be extremely valuable in the sustaining peace context? Are the current arrangements in the Executive Office of the Secretary General really carrying forward the integrated analysis with human rights input that Human Rights Upfront represented? And it seems to me there are two weaknesses in the reform package. One, I think Ambassador Byrd referred to, which is that although no doubt they come together in the Secretary General's vision, they're being pursued in practice as three extremely separate reform tracks. And the other is that they don't really say anything apart from ritual references to the human rights pillar. So perhaps the question about the political and financial climate could go to Ambassador Byrd as a representative of member states on the platform. And perhaps I could ask Oscar what it means to be a hinge to the human rights pillar, because I think I understand what in being a hinge to the development pillar means, but I'd like to know what being a hinge to the human rights pillar means.
Thank you. All the way in the back.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General, ambassadors, and colleagues. I'm Carmen Chanalhazi from the EU delegation to the United Nations, but I would rather speak in a personal capacity and as a peace builder that I discovered I am. I didn't know, but I have to say that since I work with the Peacebuilding Commission, I'm more and more convinced that we all are in our personal and professional capacities. I worked for 2 years now in New York, and I worked for 4 years in Addis Ababa in the EU delegation to the African Union. The good news is, I think, that there is a mind shift ongoing in the world. And I see the European Union, as well as the African Union and the United Nations, going into a direction where we increasingly adjust ideas around the integrated, holistic, or comprehensive approach, as we call it. I think that the reform proposals of the Secretary General confirm that. And I would also say that if the Peacebuilding Commission is a convening platform for the different elements of the UN system, then this report is a convening platform for ideas. And it is very important what you are doing here right now, combining all stakeholders, civil society, government representatives, academia. It is very important to continue it. It is important, of course, to keep an eye how to take procedures forward in the UN. We all know that it can be cumbersome, but it is a challenge that we need to face. But let's not forget that behind the high-level meeting, there is an ongoing dialogue. And this inclusive dialogue is probably the biggest added value of the discussions on peace building, sustaining peace, and the reform agenda. Now, to me, the biggest challenge will be how to combine the timings, how to phase in the different reform proposals together with sustaining peace, which is kind of framing a concept to this. And my question will be to you, how do you see it from the inside? So we have quite some insiders here, how to get to the end of the year with good results on the 3 tracks, including on sustaining peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I really must, we are running out of time. Very briefly, please, to this lady.
Thank you so much. Margaret Williams from Wafuna, previously with IPI. Just a very quick question, building off of many of the panelists' remarks. How do you see this report integrating specifically with the 2030 agenda, but within 2030, within Goal 16 on peaceful, just, and inclusive societies in terms of national ownership and implementation?
Thank you. So basically we have a lot of observation, maybe 2 questions, and I'm going to give 1 minute each to our panelists to answer. The first question addressed to you, Ambassador Byrd, is the financial and political climate good for moving forward some of the recommendations in this report? And then we would like to ask you how many hinges you are wearing, my good friend Oscar, with particular focus in 1 minute on the human rights hinge. And then I think the other question, which is very important, that was asked in the back, what are the results you hope for these 3 reform strands coming together and giving concrete results? May I start with you again, please?
In the interest of time, I will be brief. The political and financial climate, I think the challenge is not so much to sustaining peace. You're talking more about the challenging political and financial climate for multilateralism writ large, I would have thought. Because in some ways, I think sustaining peace might be a part of it, which is more susceptible to bring people together. I might be being naive. I think there definitely are challenges for multilateral cooperation at the moment. That's self-evident. I don't think too many people would take issue, though, with the importance of conflict prevention and getting better at sustaining peace rather than dealing with the aftermath of the conflict. The challenge, as always, is translating that. Finances is always going to be a big issue, and I do think it's really important. We do have to look beyond just member state contributions. I mean, the report touches on that, but how you leverage the funds the resources that are out there that countries have of their own, national resource mobilization, private sector, and the rest. So that's a really short answer to a very, very complex and difficult question, and it merits a whole other session. Just very quickly, the mind shift point is really important, and it's great to hear that on the field this is percolating down, because underlying this reform effort, the whole reform effort, it does need its cultural change. You need a different way of thinking and acting. And that has to be driven from the top, but it will only work when all of the different layers, that everybody is actually seeing things the same way and having the same discussion. So that's great to hear that example. Yes, 2030 agenda, it's all linked. Goal 16 is important. It's a very important goal, but very important not to limit it to goal 16. It really is the whole of the 2030 agenda and how that comes together with sustaining peace. And sometimes an exclusive focus on 16 can be actually detrimental. But that's not to say it's not important, but it's the broader agenda coming together.
Point. Thank you very much. Oscar?
Yeah, Martin, a very challenging question. Just, I think a lot of this is a work in progress. Let's start by saying that. I think that this is about, again, building the trust, the confidence, the understanding of what it is that we're trying to do. And as it relates to the hinge, there's already quite a lot of body of work, even very soon to be the actual description of what exactly and how this hinge is to perform. But to the very specific issue of the lynch, the cross-pillar coherence, which is at the heart of the resolution, is at the heart of the prevention, etc. I think, first of all, there is the mention on human rights in the report. It's section 21, and it makes specific references to the Human Rights Council and the different instruments and whatnot. But practically speaking, I mean, I would say that, again, let's be very focused on what is actually happening beyond the rhetoric. Is much of the programming that we tend to finance on the ground in almost all the places where we're active. There's always, interestingly, a very important human rights dimension to the work that we undertake, whether it's supporting national institutions of human rights, whether it's working with human rights advocates, whether it's actually addressing issues of transitional justice, whether it's building the capacities of governments or defending actually and promoting the rights of protectors, if you will. If you were to look how much of the Office of the High Commissioner's deployment on the ground is actually linked to financing from the Peacebuilding Fund upon government request, I think it speaks to that cross-pillar integrative nature. The case in Gambia, the case in Burkina Faso, the case in Mali, the case in Burundi, the list goes on and on. Sri Lanka, I can mention so many examples about how, and again, I think it is this notion of how we do the joint analysis with the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, being government, civil society, private sector actors and whatnot, and defining the value added of the UN with its normative and standards and its and its approach. So again, we're in the business of putting many special rapporteurs to work, actually, and I would say this with a lot of pride. Thank you.
Just get ready with a lot of oil for those hinges, my friend. Do you have, very briefly, please, we have only 3 minutes left and I want to conclude. People have commitments.
Yes, I don't want to sound like the hardware store either. Is the financial and political atmosphere propitious? No, it's not, but all the more reason to do this work. And finance is a political act as well as a supportive act. So I agree that financing and fully financing is absolutely important for all of the work that the UN is doing as well as with our partners. So thanks for making that point. Or reiterating that point for us. With regard to the European Union, it's very good to hear that you're here. I think the European Union will be making some very powerful steps in the next 2 years as it renews the Cotonou Agreement and its relationship with the Global South. So I think if we've done anything to embed sustaining peace within that agenda, that we could be extremely proud. So I hope we can work with you on that. On Goal 16, pick up the points around the whole agenda. This is really important. But in practicality, what that means is not only speaking with the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Planning on the ground. It means working with the whole of government approaches to development and building a consensus around what that is. And that's what brings an emphasis on governance and inclusion and engagement. So I think that's what it means for us. But thank you for the questions.
Thank you. Last.
Yusuf, thank you very much. Martin, HIPPO recommended very clearly support for prevention, including predictable financing. All member states supported it. What was the result? You know better than myself. Second, as regards sustaining peace, it is member states-driven initiative. So we are waiting for the event convened by President of General Assembly in April, maybe followed by Security Council discussion to see a real commitment in implementing the, let's say, agenda. Last point, as regards goal number 16, in Department of Political Affairs, we don't see it as isolated. We see it in conjunction with all other goals, and we think that in order to implement the agenda, we need to work together across the system on all the goals that are there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me conclude, take the last 1 or 2 minutes to add my own voice why we need another report or why we need and here at IPI we've developed this habit of making explicit unspoken assumptions. The report makes the assumptions that if we implement these recommendations, we'll create sustainable peace. Second, it makes the assumption that something member states are going to do so we could support them. So what we have done is we've banded up with a number of scientists to tell us what is it that member states need to take leadership on in order to create condition for this reform agenda to be meaningful. And they mentioned 4 things, very quickly, headlines. And we're going to organize on the 28th of March a discussion on this, so you're welcome to join us. Number 1, that societies stand a good chance of building and sustaining peace when they articulate a clear vision for peace. You know, speaking of the resolution, when societies define themselves as peaceful, they are much more likely to behave and organize themselves accordingly. Number 1. Number 2, and this is related to the first one, is that peace has a greater chance of enduring when it is explicitly treated as a meta-governance function, when it is enacted as a policy. And Costa Rica is often mentioned among other countries. Costa Rica, who in 2009 changed the name of its Ministry of Justice into Ministry of Justice and Peace. Another finding, this is what these researchers have found who have studied globally societies, is that, and this is what Dr. Danieli was saying, a sound investment in the education of children is fundamental. Schools that educate children to be for rather than against one another, that teach how to enlarge the us to make room for the them, that develop abilities to resolve conflict constructively rather than destructively, such schools are the hallmarks of peaceful society. The other, and I stop here because we don't have time, there is another finding that these, what they call them, researchers for sustaining peace, is that, and this is a very important assumption that is not spoken in the report, but clearly is in the mind of the drafters, and obviously the Security Council resolutions did not ask for it, that peace is like a tree, it grows from the bottom up. And community-initiated peace-building programs are usually more effective and allow for more genuine inclusion of traditionally marginalized groups who typically have a more grounded and informed understanding of local challenges and of the viability of particular solutions. So you might interject and say, big deal, we know that. Just implement fully the SDGs and implement fully the resolutions. And my answer is, right you are. I was just making explicit what is implicit in these landmark documents, particularly with the help of this empirical evidence. And if you want to know more about what we have learned from peaceful society. See you on the 28th of March. All the best. Thank you very much. Please join me.